Are you looking for a more productive and quicker method for making flying geese blocks? The 4 at a time method may be the one for you. In this tutorial, I'll take you through making the flying geese with this method, plus I'll tell you some of the pros and cons to working with this method. Throughout the tutorial, I'll share my top tips on how to get perfect flying geese. So let's get started. Hey there, I'm Ladine from Sugar Stitches Quilt Co. I create sewing and quilting videos with the goal of helping you become a better quilter. If you would like an introduction to flying geese and the simpler 1 at a time method, then check out this video that I've linked above that I made for you that takes you through that method. I also explain the general construction of the traditional quilt block. So watch that video for even more flying geese goodness. Now let's get started with the supplies that you will need for today. I'll also be showing you how to trim your flying geese, but specialty rulers are not required, they are optional. Depending on the final size of your flying geese, you will need 1 larger square and 4 smaller squares. For this tutorial, I am making a 3 by 6 inch finished flying geese. We will need to start with a little quilty math for you to determine what size your squares will need to be, but don't worry, I've simplified it for you. So using this formula, because I want my finished flying geese at 3 inches by 6 inches, I will use 1 7.5 inch large square and 4 4-inch smaller squares. We will be placing 2 of the smaller squares in opposite corners on our larger square. We will need to draw diagonal lines on the back of the smaller squares, and you can do this in 2 different ways. It's really a matter of preference. You can either draw diagonal lines on the back of your smaller squares first, or you can place the smaller squares in position and then take a larger ruler, lining everything up corner to corner, and then draw a line down the entire length of the block, being careful of this center section where we have the overlap of fabric. This method helps in that you don't have to worry about lining up your 2 drawn lines if you draw them separately first. Either way, it's just a matter of preference. I also have another tool I want to show you that I like to use, and this is the OmniGrid Fonz & Porter 1/2 inch ruler. You can see that there's a yellow line in the middle, and the ruler measures a 1/2 inch. So from the yellow line to one edge is a 1/4 inch, and from the yellow line to the opposite edge is a 1/4 inch. So I like this ruler in that if you need help with your lines to sew on, you can place this ruler down after you've placed your fabric squares. Line up the yellow line from corner to corner, and then draw lines on both sides. Now these lines will be our sewing lines. So as I mentioned, it does help if maybe you're worried about your 1/4 inch seam. And you can see now I have the 2 lines a 1/4 of an inch from my center line, which we will be cutting on this center line. So the drawn lines here will be your sewing lines, as I mentioned. This is helpful if you need a bit of extra help keeping an eye on where you need to sew. It's definitely not a requirement, and the ruler itself isn't even a requirement. You could use any ruler and measure a 1/4 of an inch from your center line and draw that if you don't feel comfortable identifying that at your sewing machine. Now, as far as marking on the back of our squares, I usually use a friction pen. I also have a pencil that I will use because these drawn lines are going to be either cut on or inside our seam allowance, so they won't be visible from the outside of your quilt. You just want to make sure that you're not using anything that would bleed through your fabric or something that may be visible through your fabric. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what you use. I do encourage you to use something with a fine tip though, so that you can easily draw your lines. And now that we have our larger square with our two smaller squares in place. Again, as I mentioned, you want to make sure this overlap here in the middle is expected, so there's no issues there. I've made sure that my drawn lines are forming one continuous line and they are lined up properly. And then I like to go ahead and pin these in place. I'll need to remove them when I go to the sewing machine, but I've done such a good job of lining everything up. I don't want this to move or shift when I take it over to my sewing machine. You can also place your pins further outside over here in these areas, and then you don't have to worry about moving them as you sew. I like to chain piece, so pinning is an absolute must for me when I'm doing the 4 at a time flying geese method. And the next step will be to sew 1/4 of an inch away from this center diagonal line, or if you've drawn your additional lines, you sew on those lines. But we want it 1/4 of an inch away from the center drawn line. I like to sew my 4 at a time flying geese using a scant 1/4 inch seam. Now you may be asking, what is a scant 1/4 inch seam? Essentially, it means a thread length narrower than your 1/4 of an inch. This helps account for the thread in your sewn line, and it gives more accuracy and room for trimming. If you need help identifying your scant 1/4 inch seam, I have a video that I've linked here for you that you can watch that helps you identify a scant 1/4 inch seam in your sewing. So now we'll take this over to the sewing machine and sew our 2 lines on either side of our center diagonal line. And now I'm back from my sewing machine, so you can see I've used black thread so you can see it better, but I have my 2 sewn lines 1/4 of an inch from that center diagonal line. And there's the back. And now we want to cut on this diagonal line down the center of our block. Just place any quilting ruler corner to corner, lining that up, and then make that cut. And now we have 2 very interesting looking units. And as you can see, things starting to take shape. We'll have 1 flying geese here and 1 here. Now the next step is to press back your triangles. And I often get asked which direction is the best for pressing. And no matter what color your fabrics are, unless it becomes a problem seeing your seam through here, it really is best to press your triangles outward, and your seams would be up facing the smaller triangles. We have 1 triangle that is on top of the other. So that is the first triangle that I like to finger press back. I don't like to press the other one back first because then I can create somewhat of a gap here in my fabrics. So start with the triangle that is sewn on top of the other one. And again, finger press that back. And then I'll press that with my iron, and then I will finger press this back and press with my iron. And we will do that with both of our units. So let me do that and I'll be right back. Okay, I am back from pressing my blocks. And as I mentioned, these look a little strange right now, but you can see that I have my seams pressed towards the smaller square. And now we're ready for the next step. So we'll take 1 of the units and then 1 more of our smaller squares. I've already drawn the diagonal line on these. And you place this down in the corner away from the 2 smaller squares. Right sides together, lining up our edges here. And we want our diagonal line facing this direction from the point of your block through the middle of your 2 smaller triangles. And then once that's lined up, I like to put a pin. And then we'll do the same thing with our second block. And then again, as we did before, the next step is to sew a scant 1/4 inch seam on both sides of this drawn line. So let me sew those lines and I'll be right back. I am back from my sewing machine and I have my 2 blocks sewn. And you can see that I have my 2 lines sewn 1/4 of an inch from that center diagonal line. And I bet you can guess what we are going to do next. That is to lay the ruler down on that diagonal line and cut along the center diagonal line. And there is one of our geese. And there's 2. And we'll do the same thing on the second block. And there's 3 and 4. Our next step is to press these back. So let me take care of that and I'll be right back. I am back from pressing my flying geese, and you can see that I have 4 beautiful geese with this method, and it's so quick. And as long as you are accurate in sewing your seams from your diagonal line, the process is fairly easy. One tip that I do have for you, you may see the method referred to sometimes as the 4 at a time, no waste flying geese. And this method would have us starting with smaller sizes than what I've given you. And then in the end, you shouldn't need to trim except these little areas where you have your dog ears. But I don't really like that method because I like to be able to trim away any possible errors and make sure that my block measures exactly what it needs to measure. Your seam allowance could be just a little bit off. It'll throw off your block in a lot of different areas. So to me, making them slightly oversized is worth it. And then the trimming of them, sometimes that can be an inconvenience. But again, to me, it's really worth it when you're talking about making precise blocks. And you'll really be able to see this when we trim these blocks. Let's talk about trimming, whether it's with a regular quilting ruler or a specialty flying geese trimming tool. So let's go through a few of these specialty trimming rulers. There are so many out there, and to me, they all have pros and cons. And probably the biggest question that I am asked is whether or not a specialty ruler is even necessary. And unfortunately, I don't have an answer for that because it's really preference and if you want to spend the money. Some of these rulers are more expensive than other ones, and there are a lot of quilters that don't want a tool that only functions for one thing. So you may feel that it's better to have quilting rulers that serve multiple purposes, whereas flying geese rulers can only be used for flying geese. But again, there are pros and cons to both. I like them because obviously they save me time and effort in trimming my flying geese. They're so much quicker than using a regular quilting ruler, which I'll show you. But again, it has to be a personal preference. So first that I'm going to show you is the block lock ruler. Now these come in various sizes. So of course the one downside would be that you have to have a ruler that matches the size of the flying geese that you're making. So in our case, we are making a 3x6 finished flying geese. Block lock has a nice area here that wedges into your seam and notches and locks in place. So you literally can put it there and it locks so that you can simply trim all the way around. You can see also that it has a dashed line for your seam allowance. And then also here in the corners, it has the perfect match so that when you trim your geese, you only have to lay the ruler down and make the cut all the way around. It's really helpful too if you have a rotating mat and you can just simply rotate the mat to cut the block. Another ruler is the Creative Grids Ultimate Flying Geese ruler. This has a 2-step process. You have trim 1 where you line up. Depending on the size of your block, you will just simply find the measurement that correlates to your size and then lining everything up. They have a 1/4 of an inch mark here, and then the lines that you match up with your point, and then you make one cut along this edge and this edge. And then you turn the ruler for trim number 2. Again, find the size of the block that you want, and then you'll need to flip your block, or if you have a rotating mat, you can rotate that. Then place the ruler down. We would have just trimmed these edges, so those are clean edges that you would line up your mark with, line up the points, and then you would make your next 2 cuts. So this is a great tool to use as well, and it does have more sizes than the block lock ruler, and then it also gives you suggested cutting instructions. Now these are the ones I mentioned before that they're not oversized, so just keep that in mind. You may want to add a 1/4 of an inch or so to these measurements if you're going to use them and you want more room for trimming. And then another ruler that I have that I really like is the Studio 180 wing clipper. And you can see this is a larger ruler and gives us a lot of different sizes. You can also see that it has the areas here where we can line up the point on our flying geese. And the process is similar, where you would make 1 cut, lining everything up, flipping your block or rotating your mat, and then making the 2nd cut. So it's similar as well. And then we have using just regular quilting rulers. One of the things that I like to do if I'm using a regular size quilting ruler is using masking tape or washi tape and find the actual size that you want your trimmed flying geese to be, and then tape that area so that you can see and you don't have to keep finding that area on your ruler. So in my case, this ruler wouldn't work because I need 6.5 inches, but just as an example, here's the 3.5 inch mark, and I would just line my piece of tape there as a visual aid for when I'm trimming my block. Again, with a regular quilting ruler, you would need to make 1 trim, rotate your block or your mat, and make a 2nd trim. Another option with regular quilting rulers is Creative Grids has been making different size quilting rulers that actually correspond to the typical sizes of flying geese. So a 2.5 by 4.5. This is a 3.5 by 6.5. And then I also have a 4.5 by 8.5. So it's a multi-purpose tool in the sewing room, but it also happens to be the exact size that I need for a flying geese block. And you can see that there are the 2 diagonal lines so that you can line up your point. You have your 1/4 of an inch line all around the block, a 1/4 of an inch line all around the ruler so that you can line that up as well. And the great thing about this, similar to the block lock, is you would put this down on your block, lining up your area here, your diagonal lines, and then looking at your point, making sure, because remember with a flying geese block, we always want to make sure that we have at least a 1/4 of an inch on top so that we don't lose our point when we're sewing this into another block. But you would line this up and then you don't have to move the fabric or move the ruler. You can just make the cut all the way around. So that's why I like these Creative Grids smaller rulers and the block lock. Because to me, sometimes when you're making more shifts and having to line things up more than once, it just leaves room for error. Okay, so let's go ahead and trim my block. I've gotten out my rotating cutting mat. This is a Martelli Notions brand mat, and I really like this one. The ball bearings on this are really smooth. I find that I have less issues when the mat is rotating with this particular brand. And then also I love the grids on this as well. We'll simply place our block on the rotating mat, and I'm going to use the block lock ruler to trim. And so again, as I mentioned, it locks into place so that we know we have everything lined up exactly as we need. And then all we have to do is trim along the outside. There's no moving of the block or the ruler itself. So I hold that in place and I'll make the first cut. If you want, you could rotate it each time. Okay, and we've made the cuts all the way around, and now we have a beautifully trimmed flying geese block. And isn't that so much easier with a the block lock ruler. Again, if you don't mind purchasing the additional rulers, then to me they really make the job of trimming flying geese so much quicker. And if you're making a lot of them, then you will certainly appreciate that. So all I have to do is trim up the rest of my flying geese, and I'll have 4 flying geese ready to go. And I'm all finished. Look how quick that was, that I was able to trim everything, and now I have my 4 beautiful flying geese that are ready for the next step, whatever that may be. If you're looking for the perfect pattern to use flying geese, my cinnamon spice pattern uses 4 by 8-inch flying geese, and it's such a quick sew. I love making that pattern. I've linked it down below in the description, and then I also have tutorials on my blog if you want even more help with the 4 at a time flying geese method. In those tutorials, I also have one that discusses making 4 at a time flying geese with directional fabrics. The 4 at a time method for making flying geese can certainly be a time saver, but there are a few things that you want to make sure and remember. The first is to make sure that you are using a scant 1/4-inch seam when you are sewing your lines on opposite sides of your diagonal lines. Sewing a scant 1/4 inch ensures that your block is more even and you have equal room around the block for trimming these oversized units. It also ensures that you have at least 1/4 inch on the top of your point of your flying geese block. This is actually my next tip for you. When we sew these blocks together, we want to make sure that we're not cutting off this point. So if we look at the back of our block, you'll see that there's an intersection of seams here. And right at this intersection, we want to be able to sew just above the intersection of these lines so that we don't cut the point off in the next block. So always make sure that you're paying attention to this intersection of seams. If you are sewing 2 blocks together, say for example, we'd be placing them right sides together and sewing a 1/4 inch seam. But I would encourage you not to sew on this block, but turn it over and sew here so you can see the point that you need to make sure and hit as you're sewing your 1/4 inch seam down this side. And my most popular tip for making perfect flying geese is to make sure that you make them oversized. I gave you the oversized quilty math in the beginning of this video, and this ensures that we have room in an equal fashion around the entire block for trimming. And this can be so key because if you are off a little bit on the top and you may have a wonky edge, anything like that, everything gets trimmed, and then you know that you have the perfect size block to move on to your next step in your quilt. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial on making 4 at a time flying geese. Make sure and like this video and leave me a comment and let me know what you think. Do you like making flying geese in this method, or do you prefer the 1 at a time method? And if you enjoyed this video, do me a favor and subscribe and hit that bell, and then you're notified when I post new quilting videos every week. And then it also allows me to continue making this free content for you. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.